Hi, I'm National Master Phil Crocker and welcome to our fourth video looking at the Alekhine's defence. In this video we're going to be looking at situations where white is a little braver than in the previous videos and pushes two pawns forward in the centre. So in terms of our 6 diagrams we're looking at, it's the bottom left one, and the most common way of doing this is that white kicks the knight on f6 by playing e5, follows up with d4 and then solidifies things with knight f3. This is a pretty popular way of playing and it involves less risk than the bottom right diagram, the 4 pawns attack, but nevertheless has some chances of giving white an edge, at least from a computer standpoint. White tends to get a small space advantage. Computers value that, humans are less adept at knowing what to do with that. So let's have a look at a few moves. I'll just bring up the Lichess study, and we're now on to the chapter white pushes the second pawn. And if we look at this, white pushes the first pawn, move on knight. Then the usual way of doing the second pawn is to push the queen's pawn. There is a line where the second pawn is the c pawn. Looks a little bit odd when you first see it. And the knight actually goes back to where it came from. And I mean, white has gained some space here. Those 2 pawns, you might say, are cramping black a little bit. But also they can become weak. So in particular, this is an additional weakness. e5 is normally a target for black, but now you've got 2 targets. And probably a couple of reasonable ways of playing this. White normally challenges the knight, either with the knight or the bishop. And here you can probably best just to defend the knight. Simple way of doing it is just to play e6, defend the knight, and open up an attack with the bishop on c5. Or the way I've usually played it is defend with the c pawn, and here you probably follow up in many cases by playing d6, looking to neutralize the pawns here. So the more common way of playing a second pawn forward is pushing the queen's pawn. Black starts to undermine the central pawns, and then just the consolidating move, knight f3. And because there's no real threat, there's quite a number of ways that black can play from this position. So we will look at some sample games for a couple of these. The modern main line is to just take the pawn on e5, and we'll look at some examples of that in a second. But there are other lines. Bishop g4 has been quite popular in the past, and I mean, one point is you're already pinning the knight against the queen, so that increases the pressure on the central pawns. And in line like this, white might just carry on developing. Something like this, white can argue that he's slightly better with a little bit more space, but there's not too much in it. Another way of playing is black can just say, well, white's not really doing anything. I'll just fianchetto my king's bishop. And white can play a little more aggressively here, though. Hit that knight. And I mean, this is playable, but white does have some aggressive ideas, maybe involving knight g5, possibly then pushing the pawn forward. And this can get a little bit awkward for black. A slightly more dubious reputation. You can play the knight here. That looks logical. You're increasing the pressure on the central pawns, developing a piece. The issue with this is that white can kick the knight. Knight goes back to the usual square, and then white has this little trick, pawn to e6. And if you were to recapture with the bishop on e6, then white can push the pawn forward and fork the bishop and knight. So it kind of forces black to recapture with the pawn, and then the development becomes a bit awkward. So it's quite a reasonable pawn sacrifice from white. So I mean, it could still work pretty well in blitz or against an unprepared opponent, but objectively it's not so good. So the main line these days is pawn takes pawn. Knight takes pawn is the best way of continuing, but it must be very tempting to play pawn takes pawn, and then black is more or less equal just by pinning the knight. And a move like c4, which might superficially look like, oh, well, the knight's got to move, I can exchange queens, the king can't, black king won't be able to castle. Black can just play knight b4, and if white exchanges queens, then black has ideas of knight c2, for example, so that's not particularly dangerous for black. So the main move is knight takes e5, and a couple of ways of playing this, a couple of ways I've tried it anyway. You can just play g6 and develop fianchetto. If white is aggressive in this way, then you can play a move like bishop e6, neutralising the pressure on f7. And in some cases, if you can imagine white playing a knight to c3, then black might be able to do some tactics with knight takes c3, uncovering attack on the bishop. So already black's starting to get some tactical counterplay. But more common these days after knight takes e5 is just a simple solidifying move c6, and white normally just develops, black does the same, moves like this, and then black critically challenges this knight, and I mean white could exchange that either by taking on d7 or letting black take on e5, but then it is more or less equal in that case. So more common is white retreats the knight, tries to keep a space advantage and argue that black's pieces are a little bit clumsy together, but it's only a very small edge if there is one. Moves like this are fairly common, and white can say, yes, I've got two pawns in the centre, a little bit of central control there, but black's pieces are on nice squares. If black has a chance to put the bishop on d6, that can work quite nicely, and then at some point there might be a break with e5, c5, and even in some cases moves like b5 or a5. So black has plenty of ways to generate some play here, and also ideas of potentially ganging up on the d4 pawn. So a reasonable game there. So that's a quick overview of the theory, if you like. I did also run some computer games, and they are in chapter 10 on the study, and for the most part they will just confirm what we've been saying now. Don't think there's anything too radical here, but you can play through some of those. And in fact, in this line, the computer just plays h3, doesn't see any real immediate advantage, so it's very slow play from white, and there isn't too much in it. And I think most of the games were drawn in this line. So that's a whistle-stop tour of high-level theory. I do have a few more games, given it's relatively popular. I have a few more games here, and let me bring up the first one. These are all classical games I've played over the years, and first one I'm going to show you is just a slightly unusual way of playing in the bishop g4 line. So here I showed the move e6, and that historically was the main move, but there is a tricky little line where you play c6, which might look an odd idea, but the point is shown after castles. I mean, there are lines where white plays knight g5 instead, and they can get a little bit sharper. So something like bishop knight g5, bishop f5 is a typical kind of idea, and then white may look to exchange the bishop, or may in some cases push the pawn forward, or maybe push this pawn forward. So there are some quite sharp lines, but it's very rare that white would actually be aware of all the details of those. So much more common is just a natural castles, and then black can instigate the plan. You just voluntarily take the knight, bishop takes back, take the pawn on e5, and then because the bishop is no longer directly hitting the b7 pawn, and black's in a much better place just to play e6, and that pawn on e5 is now a target, and it is very common that white just loses that pawn eventually. So moves like these are fairly typical, and the black knights often go on some magical little tours in the Alekhines. And one manoeuvre worth knowing is you can sometimes move the knight back to e7. Looks a bit odd, blocks in the bishop, but it's coming back on a very nice square on g6, and now there are two pieces attacking e5. Now there are three pieces attacking e5, only two defenders at the moment. Third defender, but then you attack the defender, and white is actually losing a pawn here. I mean, some possibilities of getting compensation with the two bishops and the black king still in the centre. This is a fairly typical continuation, and the game itself took on c3, and you don't even need to take that pawn on c3 straight away. You could just play a move like castles instead. I took it, and I mean, white still has some chances, right? But soon I was a little bit better after a move like castles. Queenside is another way of playing this. And black's got an extra pawn, white has the two bishops, but they're not doing too much at the moment, and black is objectively better. The game in the end was drawn, but from an opening point of view, had gone pretty well. So that's the first game. Then we'll now look at 3 games with just taking on e5. Firstly, with the objectively inferior pawn takes pawn, black can just pin the knight and develop quickly in this kind of manner. And in some cases you can put the knight on b4, but here knight b6 is okay. And I think already here black is winning a pawn, and with the pin. And once again black has won a pawn. Once again the game actually did just end in a draw, but from this position black has good chances of winning. And it was really quite natural moves that white played to get to this position. So these are all classical games. Let's look at Edmund Player against myself from the UK's 4NCL competition. And I mean, Edmund is a little bit higher rated than myself, but I think he was thinking from quite early on. So people don't necessarily have deep preparation against this line. And c4, I mean, it's playable, but it already runs the risk of some tricks, right? In a blitz game, I think you could easily imagine white playing a natural a3, kick that knight, and there's a little tactic here, maybe you can spot it. Queen takes d4, hitting the knight, and if queen takes d4, knight c2 check, and black wins a pawn. So for that reason white just defends the pawn on d4, and black already is threatening the pressure on c2, and as comfortably equalised. So white tries to keep the space advantage, but now because black is developing quite quickly, you can play an aggressive e5 break, and the bishop is now coming out quite nicely on this diagonal. Black has ideas also of putting the queen on a5, hitting the pawn on e5 if white captures. So my opponent didn't want to risk any of that, and gave me the opportunity to even push the e-pawn further. Check. And objectively black's doing quite nicely here. Once again we've won a pawn, and actually once again the game ends in a draw, which I think says more about my middle game and endgame technique than it does about the merits of the opening. So one more example. This is against Grandmaster Alekhine. In fact, the knight f3 line is pretty popular with Grandmasters. I think Luke McShane played this against me many years ago when he was a junior, and he beat me fairly handily. In fact, I think against Luke I played pawn to g6 here, but against Alekhine, who's nearly 2600 I think at the time, I played this way, which was the main line we were looking at on the Lee chess study. And I think Grandmasters often happy just to get a small space advantage like this. And maybe white's very slightly better, but black's position is also okay. Maybe hassle that bishop a little bit, and I could just drop the bishop back to g6 now. I decided to try something a little bit different. Give up the bishop but get a knight in the centre. And I'll go through the next moves fairly quickly, but white's maybe ever so slightly better, but black's also more or less okay. And for a good number of moves, we just manoeuvre. White's slightly more comfortable, but there isn't too much in it. And as often is the case against amateur against grandmaster, even if you keep things going quite nicely for a number of moves, in the end you do something not quite right. So here it's still kind of, from a computer point of view, is really roughly equal. Maybe bishop takes is better according to the computer, but even here it's almost equal. And I was probably at the time hopeful I might draw this, but I did eventually go wrong with my a5 move. Is looking to resolve things a little too quickly, and white forces my pieces back and the knight comes in, and things started to go radically wrong around here. So the opening though went reasonably well, and this is fairly typical of the sort of play you get from an experienced player, in this case a grandmaster, but just looking to get a small space advantage. So if you know some of the standard ideas, which is basically just to develop your pieces in a normal way, try and challenge the knight on e5, try and exchange that, then you very quickly get quite a playable position. So we will leave it there for this video. And just to close off, if you do have questions, please post them. Give the video a like if you like it, or subscribe to the channel. And you might want to consider buying my book, Better Chess Faster, which gives some background on how you can best use your time in both blitz and classical chess. Playing a sharp opening, which you know well or better than your opponent, like the Alekhine, is just one technique that is covered in that book. Anyway, I hope you like the video, and we'll see you for the next one.